briefly introduce you about who we are. So my name is Felek Azouga. I'm a founding director of the Africa Center of Excellence for Water Management, based at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. And the organizer of this webinar is ACEWM, which is a regional teaching and research center of excellence in a broad aspect of water management. So ACEWM is hosted under Addis Ababa University and has been established with support of the World Bank Group and the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia as part of the ACE2 project. Our mission is to advance multidisciplinary teaching, research, and innovation in water issues, generating affordable, sustainable solutions for water-related issues and management with an emphasis in Eastern and Southern African countries through a broad-based partnership approach. As part of our outreach activities, we launch webinar series in the area of water security, aquatic ecosystems management, water supply and sanitation, urban water and wastewater management, industrial wastewater management, with a particular focus on key challenges faced by African countries. The aim of the webinar series is to create knowledge and experience sharing forum, which will help to support national and global initiatives to address current water resource challenges with technological and institutional solutions, and to indicate future pathways and scenarios in line with the implementation of water-related sustainable development goals, with the aim of leaving no one behind. This is our second webinar. So his title is Redesign of Urban River Systems, Opportunities and Challenges. So by Professor Melinda Laituri, who is a Professor Emeritus of Geography in Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability at Colorado State University. The session will be moderated by Dr. Dainyacho Legasa, who is an Associate Professor of Geographic Information Systems and Remote Sensing at Addis Ababa University. So thank you very much all. So the floor is yours, Dr. Dainyacho. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Feleka, for the introductory remark. The director said, my name is Dainyacho. I am the coordinator of this webinar series at the African Center of Excellence for Water Management. I'm also associate professor at the School of Earth Sciences. I'm still trying to get used to my old new university. I just rejoined the university after serving at IAEA as a senior technical officer in isotope hydrology, where I have had the opportunity to work on a number of water-related issues. So today's topic is the redesign of urban river systems, opportunities and challenges. Given my former institutional experience, I have had the opportunity to travel to many parts of the world, and I often enjoy how much beautiful their riverine system is, particularly in modern urban setup in the more fortunate countries, let's say. But mostly in Africa, that is quite the opposite. So today we're going to hear from Professor Melinda Laituri about her own experience in the form of teaching, research, GIS, remote sensing, environmental modeling, and we're very much glad to have her here. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank those who have joined us today. And I'm sure this is going to be also recorded and will be available in the future for future reference. So the discussion is going to be in the form of, question and answer after the presentation. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, please do drop your comments on the comment section, and we'll also take up some of your questions in the form of oral presentations after we have finished the presentation by Professor Laituri. So I now give the mic to Professor Laituri. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen all right and see my slides.
Yes, yes.
It looks good.
Feasible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I'll get started. So first of all, thanks for the opportunity to present today. I'm sure that there are some people in the audience that I might have even met on some of my previous visits to Ethiopia. I've worked in Ethiopia since about 2004, doing some work in the Bali Mountains, doing some work up in Mekelle. And so I'm very fond of Ethiopia, and I think you have an amazing country. So thank you again for this invitation. So to get started, I just want to read this quote. Civilization has been a permanent dialogue between human beings and water. So water is so important to what we do and how we are able to live around the world. Today, what I'd like to talk about is some framework from which to discuss urban waters. So really focusing on cities, thinking about what is the hydrosocial cycle and how can we use that as a framework to understand urban waters. And then share with you 3 case studies, the Nairobi River Basin in Kenya, the Chittoor River Basin in Indonesia, and the Addis Ababa Riverside project in Ethiopia. And you all might have more updates to provide me with that project as I talk about things today. And then to discuss some lessons learned from all of this. So according to the UN World Water Development Report, by 2050, at least 1 in 4 people is likely to live in a country affected by chronic or recurring shortages of fresh water. That means that we're really focusing on urban areas. We're looking at vulnerable populations, those that are in need of basic services, and one of those basic services being access to water. And when we think about vulnerable populations, we're also talking about women and children who experience disproportionate impacts due to the asymmetrical power relationships and the lack of access in many places in which they live to get water. Often these discussions about women and children gets lost in the larger policy development and infrastructure discussions that go on. And so it's important for us to recognize that water is not gender neutral, and that it has a great deal to do with access to the halls of power. It also has to do with thinking about how we can meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And 2 that are very important to think about for my talk today have to do with goal number 6, which is access to clean water and sanitation, and goal 11, which has to do with creating sustainable cities. And so speaking of cities, what's so critical now is that the percentage of people living in urban areas is increasing. By 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in urban areas. As you can see by this map, this shows this projection by 2050, what will happen with respect to urban areas. So we can call this the urban century. And really, we've never done this before. We've never had so many people living in urban areas previous to this. So that means we have to think carefully about our strategies, our management plans, and how we engage with communities to improve and try to meet the Sustainable Development Goals that I just mentioned. So the hydrosocial cycle integrates the complexity of the water cycle, the environment, and people into a comprehensive approach to address water services needs and planning. It allows us to understand the physical and social relationships where we're looking at landscapes, ecosystems, watersheds, to really address the urban ecology through sustainable sustainable management of watersheds, and by balancing the competing needs, whether it's between humans and the ecosystem demand or between socio and economic demands. It is important to all of this is identifying bottom-up solutions where we're looking at participatory approaches and how we can engage with communities. And so looking at this slide here, I just want you to look at all the various factors that are there that make this such a complicated process. So thinking about recognizing the role of scale is very important, and I suggest a watershed scale as a unit of analysis that includes the administrative boundary of a city area as we begin to start to assess this, research this, and coming up with strategies for management. Water enters the urban system in multiple ways, from the headwaters to the sea. And as soon as the water enters the urban system in multiple ways, then we see that the waterscape is transformed because of how it changes as it moves through an urban system. And I should be clear that we have different upstream and downstream effects and different surface and subsurface relationships that change in urban areas. So there are multiple feedback loops here. And a stream system is not just a linear system. It's a system that changes and is modified as it moves through an urban system. So human activities drive the waterscape in urban environments, where we're looking at access to food, water, and energy that define security, define how people live on the landscape, and define these ways to create systems where we have freedom from want. We can assess how the hydrosocial cycle is modified by the intersections of human redesign and reorganization of the landscape in urban areas. We need to work beyond siloed solutions to integrate across sectors because we know that food, water, and energy are interrelated. We need to acknowledge the urban-rural spectrum, the flow of goods and services, whether we're talking about the use of things that have to do with virtual water. How much water do crops need to grow? How much water is utilized in that? And how much water is needed in urban areas? And we need to plan for the urban hierarchy, this new urban areas, growing cities, urban corridors, peri-urban areas, informal areas, and cities that are outstripping infrastructure and services or that need to replace aging infrastructure. So security issues underpin justice issues, and in particular, water justice. Emphasis of my talk today is on urban waters and what I consider to be redesigned hydrology. We talk about redesigned hydrology. We're seeing that urban waters create their own ecosystem that disrupts and changes the waterscape. We need different ways to manage water in cities because of the different systems we use. So if we think about water delivery, where does our water come from and how it is delivered to people? We see that if people want to utilize water, it must be treated in some way. And so the water treatment facilities must be in good order to be able to deliver to water users. Wastewater treatment is critical for providing clean water once it has been utilized and then put back into the system either as effluent or gray water. And then being able to manage stormwater drainage, which is all compounded by, again, the growing urban system that we are working with. So again, streams are not linear systems. They have many feedback loops, and they're all compromised and changed when we're looking at an urban water system. So I'd like to talk with you today about the urban hydrosocial cycle. And the hydrosocial cycle is a framework to better understand the deepening entanglement of the flows of water in society. By examining water issues within the context of social structures and power relationships, we can begin to mediate access to technology and technical options that are available for water management and improve planning by understanding the physical endowment of water for the cities in which we live. We can see that this framework, I think, becomes a proxy to examine water justice, to address issues related to distribution, allocation, and equity between users, including the environment. It's the context for how we define, produce, and interact with water. So we have water identified here, and we look at water in terms of its actual physicality or materiality. Where does the water come from? What actually is this water? The mechanisms by which we access water through technology and infrastructure, and then the various ways that we mediate and manage who gets water and how it is allocated across different landscapes into different populations. So in the urban system, we're looking at source water and being able to understand where that comes from and how we measure it so we know how much we have. Again, the physicality of the actual water itself. Then defining the technology and infrastructure by which we access this water, whether it's delivery, how we treat it, wastewater treatment, stormwater drainage. And then the social power structure that's in place for mediating and managing that access to water through policies, regulation, governance, as well as working with local communities and improving community engagement. So why examine urban water? To more clearly understand and manage this modified environment. We have not done adequate research and science in the integrated waterscape of urban places. We need to understand the impact of impervious surfaces, urban heat islands, how we channelize and underground rivers, the loss of riparian habitat in relation to a changing and dynamic human population that live in these urban areas. So with that as context, I'd like to talk with you about 3 different case studies that I participated in as a part of the U.S. Water Experts Program. That the U.S. government supports technical advisors through the U.S. Global Water Strategy to visit different areas and conduct different types of assessments and meetings. I visited 3 urban watersheds to assess large-scale water planning initiatives. I did field assessments, visited sites, talked with, met in government with government officials and community groups. I conducted a watershed assessment to determine the needs, gaps, and next steps for integrated watershed management in these basins that have important river systems that provide fundamental ecosystem services. These are areas where there's rapid urbanization and increasing population. These are large-scale projects, multi-year projects, multi-million-dollar projects that are supported by international interests, whether they're development banks, whether they're the national government itself, or private-public partnerships. So in Nairobi, Kenya, I examined the Nairobi River Basin and one particular tributary of that flows through Nairobi, examining the Nairobi River Basin Rehabilitation and Restoration Program. I visited Indonesia, where we did an examination of the Chittoor River Basin Roadmap, which is again another large-scale project looking at a massive set of issues there. And then I visited Addis Ababa in 2019 to review your Rivers and Riversides project, and also provided a week-long workshop on river and watershed management there. So what I'd like to do is highlight certain aspects of the hydrosocial cycle of each of these projects. I'm not going to go into depth into every one of them. Each one of them would really be their own presentation on their own because they're so complex and so big. But just sort of highlighting some of these issues and think about how we can tease out some of the details of using the hydrosocial cycle as a framework, help us better understand how to implement and make these large-scale projects successful. So in Nairobi, if you look at this, this is the Nairobi River Basin includes 3 main tributaries. I focused on the Athi River while I was there. And we were looking at the headwaters up in this area here, all the way down to the Indian Ocean. You see Nairobi is right in the center of the flow of this particular river system. There's lots of different activities that go on along the river system, from looking at building the riparian area, informal settlements, where does sewerage go, highlights of extraordinary places to visit along the way, and all kinds of changes in the system itself. In terms of the system that goes through Nairobi city itself, it's about 4 to 5 million people that are dependent upon this river for a lot of different types of ecosystem services. So here's our hydrosocial cycle of the Nairobi River Restoration Project. And the aim of this project was to create a healthy river. And so in terms of defining a healthy river and thinking about the materiality or the physicality of water, they divided the river into river reaches to be able to conduct rehabilitation, restoration, and cleanup. They're very aware of point and non-point source pollution, and their data needs had to do with trying to develop different metrics for water quality, as well as to improve the river gauging system to measure river flows. The technology and infrastructure piece, they really thought about the need to engineer the urban landscape. So improving the flood zone and riparian habitat, which had been overdeveloped and really lost as the river moves through the city. The key aim of this, the first stage of this project, was to look at wastewater treatment plants, trying to address the very serious problem of sewerage and impacts on water quality. And again, this speaks to the need for data management to be able to inform how you can monitor this over time. And so how do you operationalize something like this? Well, there are many different things that were part of this strategy. The key focus was on multi-sector participants, meaning that not only was government involved, but so were local communities to be able to make this project begin to come to fruition. So the first aim of this, and this is similar across all of these three projects, was to assess the role of government. And what happened, and I'm sure there may be some individuals on the call this morning that are from Kenya, and I know that you had amazing institutional changes to accommodate better water management. There's been changes at the national level in terms of creating access to water as a right, and development at the city level of an integrated water, urban water master plan. Avenues of communication and collaboration were improved by being able to work with these local communities. And in many instances, I met women in management positions across agencies, which I think is very important, again, for changing the way that we start to implement these projects and are inclusive in terms of hearing multiple voices. Another critical part of the project was technology in terms of really figuring out what is the infrastructure that is needed for water and wastewater treatment in particular, and thinking about the engineered solutions to recreate these flood zones and reconfigure the riparian habitat. And so many of these projects are called restoration projects, and I take issue with that term restoration. I think rather we are talking about redesign, because we're not restoring stream systems to their original conditions. We're changing them to be adaptive to the urban environment and being able to understand what we need to do to the water system in urban areas to be able to provide these multiple services, which are very different from the natural environment, where we're looking at things that have to do with the riparian habitat, or we may be looking at how to assure adequate water supply for forest growth or things like that. In the urban system, again, we're looking at water supply, water quality, wastewater treatment, and again, the data that supports our understanding of those needs within the urban environment. A key part of this project was to, again, develop this multi-stakeholder initiative through community participation. And so what we established were something called water resource associations, which are run by communities and provide, and have done all kinds of different projects, from doing things like tree planting efforts in the upper watershed to doing other kinds of activities throughout to ensure engagement of local communities, as well as schools, to help with this issue of community participation and being able to understand the role of the river in their everyday lives. A key aspect of this, and this is a theme that runs through all of these projects, is the need for relocation and resettlement of communities. If floodplains in urban areas are going to be recaptured and riparian areas are going to be restored, then we need to move people. And this is complicated, and that's why this role of community participation is so important, to be able to engage these local communities and raise their awareness and make sure they understand that they are also part of the negotiation process for creating strategies for improvement to the water system in their cities. So that's the Nairobi river system. I'd like to shift to the Chittoor river system. Again, many common issues here, although this is a massive watershed itself, and it's considered one of the most polluted river systems in the world. And this entire watershed has about 27 million people that are dependent upon it, but it's also a very, very critical supply, providing water for Jakarta, one of the mega cities in the world. There have been massive land use, land cover change, considerable pollution and waste that dominate here, both from the domestic and industrial, and there's a real lack of appropriate infrastructure for the number of people that are really dependent upon this as a water supply. So this project, the Chittoor River Basin project, their aim is river rehabilitation. So important to them were considering the headwaters of this system and identifying springs and how to protect those, because that sets the signature for water quality across the entire river basin. Understanding agriculture and aquaculture and the levels of contamination, the river pollution and contamination that comes from some of these practices, and again, making sure that we understand the data needs for being able to measure the appropriate water to be able to get to people in urban areas. The technology and infrastructure piece is looking at how we can protect these headwaters, the role of river cleanup and how that can proceed, creating floodplains and addressing stormwater drainage, looking at how to improve fish farm improvements. There's 3 dams along the Chittoor River, all of which are utilized with fish farms that can create problems with the water quality in those particular reservoirs. And so creating those kinds of improvements is very important. But doing all of these things, again, means that appropriate housing and services need to be constructed if communities are going to be impacted. And the need for long-term data monitoring that can inform how to manage this water. We look at the social power structure, there's many different ways this is being implemented. And again, in terms of the institutional piece of this, there was a presidential decree to say that one of the key things that will happen during this particular president's term in office will be to clean up this river system, which is a huge challenge, and then to create this blueprint for how water resources can be improved. A key player in this are military units as implementers of doing things like river cleanup and floodplain creation. And they are embedded in different villages throughout the entire watershed to be able to facilitate some of these activities. Strong relocation and resettlement plans are also planned, and research is also being conducted. So some of the highlights of this particular project have to do with looking at what are their current water management solutions that are in place right now. What we see is again the military assistance to clean up rivers and redesign them in terms of cleaning them up and creating this channel and reestablishing the floodplain. Efforts to provide clean water through water delivery trucks. Looking at collecting plastic water bottles and providing this as a means to create neighborhood trash banks where neighborhoods can collect these kinds of results or collect all the materials and then be able to sell them and provide some funding for neighborhood improvements. And then engineering solutions. This is the current strategy that they're being undertaken. Something that's really innovative that they've done along with creating trash banks has been establishing these eco-villages that work very closely with the military units that are embedded in these different villages. It enhances communication between the government offices. It increases a high level of community engagement to really understand these upstream, downstream efforts to collaborate between different villages, and improves local government commitment. An important piece of this is the role of women. Women's groups run many of the eco-villages that conduct these reach-scale rehabilitation efforts. They coordinate with schools, and they run many of these neighborhood trash banks to collect and sell trash. And now to your city, looking at the Addis Ababa Riverside project. So much research has been done on this project, and there are numerous reports written by your university that provide a holistic and rich understanding of this project. I was able to review all of those when I was there in 2019. And so you can see that it starts again from the headwaters down to the point in the watershed where we can see the whole area across the city of Addis Ababa, where we're looking at how to understand, how to redesign and create a healthy river system. So the aim of the Addis Ababa River Restoration Project is really beautifying the river. And what we need in terms of understanding water, again, the physicality or materiality of water, is what is the river function across the city? How do we understand the river pollution and contamination and begin to collect data so we have metrics about water quality? In terms of technology and infrastructure, looking at river redesign and how to monitor that, along with river cleanup, flood zone creation, and housing construction to support resettlement or movement of neighborhoods out of these areas. So what is this power structure with relation to the social structure with relation to this project? Well, there have been university partnerships, and again, I would ask you, are you still participating in providing baseline data for this very important project in your city? You have external construction partners. I know China has been very important in creating this project and moving things forward. What is the status of the relocation and settlement plans? And then in terms of governments, looking at this as a priority project and solicitation for funding. Where does the funding come from? Private-public partnerships, looking at some of the national funds available to this and how this has been implemented in Addis. So what I learned from this project was really that basic research on the river system has been undertaken, and there's a very strong role for science and for creating training opportunities. However, an outcome also has been the need to relocate and resettle communities that's central to this project. So the need to improve communication and community engagement is central to the success. Efforts for relocation need to be communicated early in the project for input on options for alternative housing and where those might be located to best fit changing patterns of commerce, changing patterns of how people operate within the city. So those are the structure of these three different projects and thinking about it within this hydrosocial cycle framework. I'd like to talk a little bit about lessons learned now, and so more generally across these three projects. The first thing has to do with water data. And I would say that water data is foundational to water planning and understanding the dynamic nature of this particular urban water cycle. It potentially could lead to comprehensive water planning. So it's important to develop a data policy that I think is open access, that provides sharing across agencies to create integrated databases, again, for an open source tool that people can be able to utilize and understand what's going on with respect to these water metrics. So this is a challenging project. It's very big, and I'm going to suggest this a lot, that pilot projects need to be undertaken, taking a smaller piece of the puzzle, a smaller piece of the problem, and testing it out, and then thinking how it can be scaled up to work across the entire suite of the needs for good data policy and good data practices. ways to explore this are through the enhanced use of mobile tools that have just exploded with our handheld devices such as mobile phones and smart tablets, and that being able to use remotely sensed data that we can really track growth and development in the city and begin to really integrate those kinds of metrics into our data policies. Another piece of the data puzzle has to do with local knowledge. What a great way to engage with communities through participatory mapping, through identifying what are issues in their communities and where are the hot spots. And utilizing that helps us to prioritize these issues, again, through demonstration and pilot projects that can engage community and having communities do monitoring that can feed into these data management strategies and be able to enhance and improve the kinds of data we collect and how we understand what's going on with water at a very fine spatial scale and then scaling up across multiple communities. Partnerships are essential to all of this. And I'm stressing community engagement because this is how we build trust, we improve participation, and we have consultation on projects. So partnering with schools and universities for river cleanups, for rapid stream assessments, providing water quality kits, partnering with industry and business who can sponsor river cleanups and partner with schools, create internships for young people, and local government that can facilitate and support these kinds of efforts, improve public relations, and enhance all of this through publicity, as well as also providing internships for young people to get them on a trajectory for employment and experience. I talked earlier about the role of women, and this is an under-examined area that also needs improvement. We need good planning and funds to support the implementation of programs for women and to include women in leadership roles. Women were evident in Kenya and Indonesia. In Kenya as leaders of Water Users Association, in Indonesia as leaders of eco-villages, and in Ethiopia, many of the members of the technical teams that I met with when I was there are women as well. So again, we need to really be working on this and improve not only access to water for women, but also women in decision-making roles to improve some of these avenues for communication. Another under-examined piece of looking at the water sector is addressing issues related to corruption. And how can this be addressed? First of all, there's a lack of data with respect to this, but there's lots of different programs that have been trying to understand what is going on and how this can be improved. So some things just to consider with respect to this topic. Water management often works across multiple agencies, and these large-scale infrastructure projects means that there's usually a large capital investment and decision makers have a sweeping discretionary power. How do we assure accountability, that the relationship with the civil society remains strong, and that the technical complexity is well understood by the partners across all sectors? Informal settlements also create their own avenues for corruption. We have service providers and water cartels often operating in informal settlements where there's issues related to water connections, land title, how water is delivered. And if water is delivered outside of regulatory controls, what does that mean for the quality of service and the quality of water? The third issue has to do with privatization, thinking about private-public partnerships where sometimes private actors pursue profit maximization over public needs. And so, they oftentimes a private-public partnership may provide water but not sanitation, or water is commodified where it is sold, and so that creates a different set of issues. And then the final issue being gentrification, the moving of informal settlements to create gentrified places where issues of land tenure and displacement can cause conflict and distrust. So what we really need is to invest in terms of looking at water, plus local data, plus in community engagement that equals shared governance. And so this role of civic technology, how to include local populations, how to identify common problems, share goals, and facilitate and ensure communication. And the key message here is thinking about the investment in youth. The need to understand that they are sustainability drivers and that they are the leaders of the future, and will end up trying to solve some of these problems that I've been discussing this morning, this afternoon. So how do we let the river do its job in all of this? You know, the river is also a key participant. The river provides connectivity across the landscape, across the cityscape, and it improves not only connectivity in terms of the physical flow of water, but also in terms of ecosystem services and roles to improve lives across the city and in the countryside. So flood management, protecting riparian zones, creating river parks and green spaces. These are all things that we need to enable the river to do through these kinds of big projects that I've just described. So we're back to the issue of justice and thinking about the role of water justice and how do we give water a voice. So who speaks for the river? In the United States, we recently had protests with respect to a big oil pipeline that was constructed across indigenous lands in the United States. People came out and protested against this and said that we are water protectors. We speak for the rivers and we consider water sacred, and we consider the need that it's important to protect this as a resource, not only for the river itself, but because of our cultural heritage. There are 3 rivers right now that actually have legal standing in the world. And so should rivers have rights? This is my question to you. The Whanganui River in New Zealand and the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India all have legal standing where the intrinsic rights of rivers are respected, where rivers have spiritual, physical, and metaphysical characteristics. And there's the rules of law in these countries that have said we are going to give rivers legal standing. So other aspects, though, intersecting not only with the rivers themselves, but with human needs, have to do with ways to also promote water justice, water as a human right. So in the United States, we passed the Paul Simon Water for the World Act in 2014. That was unanimously signed in our Congress and builds on the Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act of 2005. Water as a human right was recognized by the UN General Assembly in 2010, and in 2015, the human right to sanitation was recognized. And then there are efforts to create treaties on water as a human rights at the grassroots level, and this is a global effort around the world. So solutions are cyclical, they're not linear. I think some lessons learned from this have to do not only with identifying waste streams and figuring out ways for managing these separate waste streams through recycling and monitoring, but also coming up with resiliency strategies where we have local community participation, we engage with local business, and we create regional knowledge partnerships, just as this seminar demonstrates that we can talk across from around the world and have this kind of meeting and discuss these very important issues, that we need to adopt transdisciplinary and transcultural approaches, and that we need a commitment. We need long-term investments. We need to identify benchmarks and deliverables so that enhances and improves accountability and responsibility, so that people see that there are results and that things are happening and that money is being spent wisely. So some new lessons for us to consider as we move forward. That uncertainty is inevitable, but it is not a reason to not make a decision. That existing assumptions and practices are called into question, and we might have to consider unthinkable alternatives to come up with new solutions. And we need to examine the power dimensions of governance and whose voices are not heard. Legitimacy and empowerment can emerge from diverse sources, and so we need to improve negotiation and outreach to ensure that multiple voices are brought to the table. Culture matters, different groups of people, different sectorals, different disciplines. Place matters, geography matters, where we live and how we address these issues. So I'm going to leave you with this parting thought and really speaking to the role of the pandemic and the new challenges that this brings and all the new research that is coming out about this. The pandemic has exposed inequality and inequity across the globe and challenges us to be bold in seeking innovative ways to address the urban hydrosocial cycle. And you can see that this is really looking at, how we can understand the economic lockdown that has occurred, the sharing of vaccines around the world, the need for this, how they are distributed across cities, how this is impacting where water points are located because we need more hand washing stations. This speaks to the materiality of water and how we improve that in urban landscapes. And so with that, I will stop and I will ask for questions. I think I can go ahead and stop sharing now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Laituri. It was very inspiring and quite widespread, that touch upon quite a widespread aspect of urban hydrology and problems of, the urban society in terms of clean water supply to the ever-increasing urban population, which is becoming more and more a challenge to the world community, international institutions, national governments, etc. And this Center for One has been established, in fact, with the objective of providing this kind of platform where we bring about issues that are pertinent to the region at large. So we're very happy that you gave us such an insightful presentation and shared us your experience from different parts of the world, from our neighbor Kenya, Nairobi, from Addis Ababa, a project which is now being shepherded by the Prime Minister himself, which is also quite interesting. So now I think we open the floor for discussion and questions. I haven't seen any comments so far. I read a comment by our dear friend Seifu. Hi, Seifu, from South Africa. If you have anything to say, if you have questions, we now open the floor to a few questions from the participants.
Did you want me to address these questions in the chat?
I am opening up the floor to the rest of the participants, and probably you can address them along with a few questions that would be raised from the participants, hopefully.
Okay, I'll wait. And yes, I will share the slides. I'll send them to you for everyone to have. I actually tried to send them earlier, but it was too large, so I'll have to send it by a large email attachment so that you can have access to the slides.
Yeah, we'll try to organize it, in such a way that we have it somewhere in a common place, and then everyone could have access to that. Professor Seifu was also putting a question there, saying that some argue that in Addis Ababa, the urban river restoration project program benefits the urban elites and not the poor necessarily. That is a conundrum. So I think that's a very interesting question. So Q3, is it possible to do economic valuation of restoration? And the first question, I think, from his side is who is going to benefit from the process? So quite interesting questions there.
Yes, I think these are very...
Please go ahead and probably you can start addressing those questions.
Okay, I think these are very challenging questions, and they really have to do with, again, this underlying issue of justice and how do we improve this across these big projects that oftentimes I think are very visible the results of them can be seen quite obviously. But I think the poor people, these communities that are often removed or resettled, do not have a strong enough voice in how the projects are implemented. And that creates a lot of problems. So I think this is central to all of these projects. You mentioned who should pay to restore the river system and run it. Well, largely it will be the responsibility of governments to run these things. But it needs to be shared. And so being able to identify good ways to go to some of the development agencies, as well to identify, you know, I'm not a big fan of private-public partnerships, but it is an avenue forward to try to be able to get shared resources that are so desperately needed. I think also that we do have to do economic valuation of these projects. And that's why I talked about making sure that there are well-identified benchmarks and deliverables along the way that are shared across all different sectors. If we do not have participation with respect to local communities, these projects will not be successful. And so it's very, very important to improve the engagement with local communities. I can't stress that enough. And so I don't have great answers for your questions, but I think there is space for starting the dialogue and the discussion that needs to take place to improve all of these things.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll share. There are some questions to share. Excuse me. Professor's contact details. So I'm sure she'll be willing to do that. There are some questions now on the comment platform and questions, I think. There's one question. What do you recommend on the method for volunteers' data quality control? So I think that is meant for participatory mapping, probably. And then there's another one from Jacob Guy. The success in rehabilitation and restoration of Nairobi River is largely due to political goodwill and not necessarily good policies and best practices. So I think he needs a comment on that. That is probably true also for Addis Ababa. I mean, this is really politically driven, mainly shepherded, as I said, by the Prime Minister himself. So yes, quite interesting. Another question from Dr. Desenedau is on the intermittent nature of flow in Addis Ababa River Basin. Do you think the river beautification aspiration will be achieved? So if you have anything to say about that,
Yeah, lots of issues to cover here. So I appreciate the question about volunteers and data quality. Something to think about, you know, there's lots of programs that have been put in place now, whether there's a youth master chapter in your city to be able to work with. There have been really good efforts to improve quality assurance and quality control for these kinds of efforts to collect data. And I think it also provides an opportunity to enhance relationships between universities, between governments and young people to do these kinds of technical activities to ensure that we have good data. What's the key thing with data? Well, metadata, knowing that you've got good practices in place to collect that data. So I'd say working with, you know, the universities and government to create these partnerships would be a key way to make sure that you're improving and getting good data control. I really appreciate the comment about the Nairobi River system and the role of political goodwill, and I think that's absolutely spot on. Again, I think there's efforts to create policies and best practices, but at the end of the day, if people don't see political goodwill and new relationships being established, they're not going to happen. You know, in the United States where I live, we have problems with river flows. I'm looking at this intermittent nature of flow in Addis Ababa River Basin. We have the same issue with river flows in where I live in Colorado. And we can't create more water where there isn't more water. You know, we are in an age of climate change. We must be adopting adaptive strategies. We must be practicing conservation strategies. So these are all different management things that need to be implemented that go along with our very important urban water management plans to be able to conserve water. And so I think that people need to be aware of those changing nature of a river system. So again, back to how can the river do its job and how do we recognize what its job is?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that last statement is key to the puzzle itself. How do we allow the river system to function as a natural system? I was fortunate enough to live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Vienna, Austria. And one of the things that gives its beauty is the river Danube, which is shared by many European countries. And that is a livelihood to many. It is, you know, the means for transportation. It balances the microclimate there. So, you know, beautification, no doubt, is quite important. But in addition to that, how do you see the role of, you know, river rehabilitation or reclamation, or however you would like to call it? How do you see its value in terms of, you know, helping the poorest of the poorest in the urban environment, in the urban setup?
Yeah, I think that's the really challenging question here. And I think it comes back to making sure that the poorest of the poor are recognized as key stakeholders in this activity, and that they are engaged in a way that they see some kind of participation and ownership in what is happening to their city where they live, and they are participants in what's happening here. I know that sounds very kind of blue sky and maybe too optimistic, but people need to understand with what is the role of the city, what is the role of the river, and how they are dependent upon it, and how can that shared relationship with the river be translated again across not only the very poor, but also the people who are trying to improve the river itself. So again, recognizing the very poor as key stakeholders in this and creating space for them at the table is really essential to a first step. And, you know, I see a question here that's saying, you know, are stakeholders been involved in all stages of these different projects? And no, they haven't. This is the process that's being implemented now to learn how best to engage communities, to not have top-down approaches, but to have bottom-up strategies and to be inclusive, which is hard work and it's difficult to do.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I would like to recognize here some of the comments that were provided by I think Alam Saged from IUMI, where he tries to state that there is an ongoing activity on the Akaki river fields. So this is one of the rivers that crosses the city of Addis Ababa, and he mentions that there are several components to what they do and what they look at in terms of pollution risk, hydroclimate risk, and water value, governance, and etc. So we really appreciate your input to that. If there are any more questions or comments that you would like us to address, we can take a few more minutes before we close off the session. This is rather a very interesting discussion. So the last one I see here, given the rural-urban migration, how do we sustain the gains of such projects? For example, the cleared floodplains. So I don't quite understand the question, but if you can address in terms of, you know, what importance that would bring about in terms of rural-urban migration.
So, you know, this migration is such a huge issue around the world and in many places, where people are moving from and moving into, and where are they able to create places to live. And so this is another key strategy that, you know, governments need to address, that, you know, I think probably creating avenues for knowing where people can actually move when they come into places is essential. And that's going to be a key aspect of managing these informal settlements and creating places that are more environmentally and socially sound for them to move into. It's just going to be one of these key challenges that, again, needs good conversation about, so that people are having some kind of way to address this, as opposed to having just thousands and thousands of people move to these informal areas. I don't have a good answer for you, but I think just starting, again, the dialogue is really, really important to be able to do. So thanks for that question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So more questions or comments? So yeah, how do you address the land use policy issue, the buffer zone of river system during rehabilitation? So most of these questions, I think, seem to revolve around, you know, the issue of social justice in terms of, you know, when you develop this kind of projects. I remember somehow, somewhere, about a dam project, an advertisement, kind of advertisement, in fact, by the company itself in French. Faire avancer le monde sans faire reculer l'homme, cela s'appelle le développement durable. So sustainable development is one that does not push away people, you know. So how do you look as a social justice or injustice, if you wish, of such kind of development? You know, is the rehabilitation worth it? So that's the question, I mean.
Yeah, I think it's not just giving voice to people, but it's giving them avenues for action. You know, how can they participate, and how can they feel that they're being part of the decision-making process? So if you're talking about creating buffer zones for rivers during rehabilitation, that's really important for the, you know, the physical infrastructure for changing how that river looks. But early engagement with these communities, having them understand the purpose of these projects, having them understand how they can be part of them, engaging them in identifying where they may need to move and how that move will happen, and what kind of support will be allocated to them if they need to move. Are new places being constructed for communities to move to, and are they in places that are accessible to their current places of work, or how they've been earning a living? All of these things need to be added to this. And so again, it's a complex process, and it's not just about the technical requirements of redesigning the river itself. Particularly in this urban area, it's so critical to talk to the people, raise their awareness, and build their trust that this can be a project that can be beneficial to them. And that, again, is going to be hard to do.
Right. So I think, okay, Professor Saifu is here again, who is illegal, by the way, when those legally settled get access to land because of their economic status. That's a very provocative question. I don't know if we can answer those questions.
That is for Adana to answer.
That's a really hard one. What I would say is, you know, I know how complicated land tenure issues are in many different countries across the African continent. And so this is something that is really, really challenging, and is a whole nother area, a whole nother set of presentations that we could have. And so I don't have a good answer for you on that one, but it definitely should be part of these strategies.
Right. Okay, I think we have had a very interesting session. This was extremely encouraging, in fact, for the center as well, because we were very happy to have had more than 70 active participants on this forum. And I'm sure this is going to be also available for an offline participation and watching in the future. So we very much appreciate, Professor, for your presentation. Thank you very much for all the participants, for all the active participation. So with that, I don't know if anyone else wants to have the floor for a closing statement.
Yeah, Dr. Danyachu.
Dr. Falaka, yes, Dr. Falaka would like to probably say final words for the closing. With that, I hand over the mic to Dr. Falaka. From my part, I would say I very much enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Laituri. So this is one of very interesting webinar. We have, of course, at the time, more than 80 participants. So we have some particular interest in the area of data development. So I hope we'll continue to collaborate. And I think Dr. Alam Sagad also is working, IWMI is also working in that area. And currently we have a new project based is urban suburban nexus towards One Health approach. We are trying to link it with the health issue, how such activities can improve the health of the community, of the urban people. And I think the issue of data policy and the database pilot projects, I think we can discuss in this area and we can continue our collaboration. So coming to the end, so we have a next seminar around April 25, that will be on harnessing solar energy for water and wastewater treatment in Africa, which is actually very important issue, and which will be delivered by Dr. Indal Kacho Sahari Demise, senior researcher at the United States Environment Protection Agency in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I invite all of you to attend the next webinar. With this, I would like to thank Professor Laituri for her excellent presentation, and we will continue our collaboration on the project which I mentioned. Thank you very much. Thank you all the participants. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was very nice to be able to present to all of you. I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.